can you hear me in the back? All right, great. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and Colonel Tussey. As Brent just said to you, what we're going to do today is provide you this overarching briefing that's going to sort of encapsulate the entire course using an historical example to familiarize you with this process. And again, if you feel overwhelmed, that's by design. So don't get nervous and sweaty. Well, yeah, get nervous and sweaty, but at the same time, just feel confident, because when we're done with this, I want you to all understand when you walk out of here that by the end of this course, every single one of you in this room is going to be able to do this by yourself. Without an instructor present, you will be able to do exactly what we're going to show you up here. Okay? Now, the methodology of this is to show you at the very beginning of the course what the end result of the course is going to be. In the past, we've had complaints from students or concerns from students that if we don't show you the end result, then all of the disjointed sort of lessons leading up to it don't make as much sense. You're not able to make the connections to see, well, why do we do this and where does this fit in and all that kind of thing. So just think about it this way. If you had never been in a kitchen before, you've never been in a kitchen before, or you were really only vaguely familiar with it, if you were given something like this, you would have a difficult time visualizing what you were doing. It seems like a bunch of disjointed activities and phrases and terminology that doesn't really lead you to something. But if you knew that the end result was this, then you could say, oh, I get it. Now this starts to make some sense. So what we're going to do today is we're going to show you the cake. All right? We're going to show you the cake so that by the end of the course, you'll be able to do this. So, here. Yes, indeed, we are good. We are good. They save the best for last. Okay, so again, here's the methodology. We're going to show you an historical example of a complex military operation overlaid and viewed through the lens of today's current joint planning doctrine. And that's going to give you this broader understanding of operational design and the joint planning process. And I know that all of you did the reading, because if you didn't, Major Kaplan is going to hurt you afterwards. But we used the North Africa campaign because we had a really good book that you could use to get yourself familiarized with Operation Torch. And at the end of the day, we're going to introduce to you this language of operational design in the joint planning process. Okay, so before we even begin that, we have to talk about what is operational design. And operational design is, as one of our colleagues here in this building, Dr. Riley, has stated very clearly, that operational design is a way of distilling clarity from complexity. That the operational design process is designed to take what is a complex, difficult, ill-defined problem or ill-structured problem and apply some level of structure to it so that you can better understand it and therefore better come up with some solutions to get after it. And it's an iterative process. You're going to hear that again. Every one of your instructors is going to say this over and over again, that this is an iterative process. And what does that mean? It means that it's circular. You've got to continually go back, re-examine assumptions, re-examine the facts, update new information, go back and check to make sure that you didn't miss anything. Do the risks that we thought about still apply here? It's iterative, and you will see that throughout the course. And what it ends up being able to do is give us some viable approaches to solve complex military problems. What is the operational approach? Well, it's the broad description that the commander provides to his or her organization it's a description for how they're going to apply force and the steps that the force must take to achieve the desired military end state. That's simply what it is. It's a broad description that the commander provides. And what we're trying to do is to move us from the current condition to the desired condition. And you'll read some things later on in the term that try to get you away from this notion of end state. Most of you realize that there is no such thing as an end state, right? It's a desired condition, but it's constantly evolving. So what we're trying to do is to get from where we are right now, which is not satisfactory, to a better condition, right? Okay. In order to do that, we have campaigns. And the North African campaign is a campaign. What is a campaign? According to JP 3.0, a theater campaign is the overarching framework that synchronizes and ensures that all the operations within that theater are synchronized to meet the objectives. Okay? And the major building block of the campaign is a major operation. And a major operation is a series of tactical actions. When strung together, they become a building block of the campaign. The North African campaign, its strategic objective was to ensure Allied control of all of North Africa, and it consisted of two major operations. Operation Torch, which you've read about, which was the actual joint forcible entry operations to get into North Africa, and then the operations in Tunisia, which were follow-on, which you did not read about, and I won't talk about those too much today. All right, so we talked about joint forcible entry operations. Joint doctrine for that defines a joint forcible entry operation as something designed to seize and hold a lodgment against armed opposition. Many of you know what that is because you've actually practiced it in your careers. What is a lodgment? As it says there, it's an area that when seized and held allows for a buildup of forces and some maneuver space so that further operations can take place. All the Marines in here know exactly what I'm talking about because that's what the Marine Corps is designed to do, is to seize lodgments. Okay? Operation Torch had 3 simultaneous combined joint forcible entry operations. And you can see the details there, and we'll get into these as we go through the briefing. Okay, operational design is made up of 4 primary steps. In each one of these steps, you have to apply some of the kind of thinking that we've been talking to you about throughout the course. Starting in your leadership classes and so on, you've been talking about the different types of thinking: critical thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking. Operational design requires that you use this kind of thinking. Again, everything that we do here in ACSC is for a reason. So the first step is understand strategic direction and guidance. We want you to use critical thinking. What is it that we're being asked to do? Examine all that and try to figure out what is the nub of what it is that we're trying to do here. The next step is to understand the strategic and operational environment. You're going to have to apply some systems thinking there, because most of us, especially those who are in the intelligence business, understand that operational environments are composed of systems interacting with each other, right? Systems thinking. The next one is define the problem. You got to apply both critical and systems thinking there. What is it that we're trying to do? And then lastly, as you develop the operational approach, as Brent said, we want you to use some creative thinking. This is where we apply the operational art. All right. Again, the broad actions the force must take to achieve the desired end state. Now, doctrine gives you guys 13 primary tools with which to do that. The elements of operational design are just that. They're tools that you have that are available to you to describe what it is that the force must do. And each one of these can be used in combination with the others to create that good, solid picture so that the organization that you're leading has a good idea of what it is that you as the commander or senior staff officer want them to do. And we'll go through these here during the briefing. So again, it's a toolbox that helps the artist create that picture. All right, let's get into Operation Torch. So step 1, understand the strategic direction and guidance. In order to do that, we've got to talk about some history. And again, that's one of the reasons why we teach you guys history in this course, so that you can understand what it is that you're getting after here. So, not to insult your intelligence, but the major forces that we're talking about here on each side in the North Africa campaign, at least initially, on the Allied side, the primary forces are the United Kingdom of Great Britain and its empire, the United States, and to a lesser extent, the Free French, designated by the Croix de Lorraine right there, okay? One major ally that's missing from this picture, of course, is the Soviet Union, which did not play a direct role in the campaign in North Africa, only insofar as one of the major reasons for conducting a campaign in North Africa, at least stated this way, was to take some pressure off the Soviet Union, who were being attacked heavily by the Germans. On the Axis side, the two major players are Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and to a lesser degree, at least at the outset, Vichy French collaborationist forces. Again, the major Axis partner, who is not depicted here, is Japan, which played no role, direct or indirect, in the campaign in North Africa. Now, December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks the United States. On the next day, the 8th, the United States declared war against Japan. On the 11th of December, 1941, at the behest of the Japanese, Nazi Germany and then later Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, bringing the United States into the war in Europe. On the 22nd of December, following these declarations, the British government put together a very high-level delegation of political and military leaders, put them on a couple of Royal Navy vessels and send them across the Atlantic to meet with their counterparts in the United States. This conference, which started on the 23rd of December, 1941, was called the Arcadia Conference. It was led by the Prime Minister of the UK and by President Roosevelt, and it consisted of the combined chiefs of staff, a number of other political and diplomatic bigwigs. There's, again, in the book that you read, it describes some of the debates that occurred during the Arcadia Conference, specifically this push-pull between the United States and Britain, where the United States' initial default position was, we need to go for the jugular right now. We need to put major military forces on the ground in Western Europe and attack directly into the heart of Germany and defeat them right now. The UK said, hang on a second, guys. First of all, you're not ready to do that. You may think you are, but you're not. And we know that because we've tried it 3 times and have been driven off the continent 3 times in the last year and a half. And we need to put the brakes on here and do some things ahead of time to set the conditions so that ultimately when we do put forces in Western Europe and attack directly into Germany, we're ready and we can prevail. And that was what this debate was all about. This desire of the United States to go after Germany never slacked, really until 1944, when we actually did put forces into Normandy. Senior leaders in the United States were constantly pushing back at Great Britain, saying, you guys are holding us back, you're wanting us to do things to help support your empire, we shouldn't be doing this, etc. And those of you who have studied World War II understand that that debate was ongoing at least until 1944. At the Arcadia Conference, the other thing you have to understand is the context in which this was occurring. The major British imperial fighting that was going on at this point was in North Africa, in Libya and Western Egypt. And so Churchill was obviously very concerned about that and was saying, well, look, if we want to put U.S. forces into the fight against Germany, one of the things that maybe we can consider is to put them into Algeria so that they can attack the rear of the fascist forces in North Africa and take some pressure off the Suez Canal. This is the genesis of Operation Torch. Okay, so the major result of the Arcadia Conference was a statement of grand strategy from the British and the United States. And here are the major points of that grand strategy. This grand strategy was not substantially adjusted for the remainder of the war. And this is where we get all of the real significant strategic direction that drove military planning for the next 3 years, 4 years. So the first one, the A there, is to work the victory program of armaments. And this was a specific plan that was designed to essentially make the United States the arsenal of democracy, to begin producing stuff and mobilizing people so that there would be enough stuff and people to ultimately win the war. And that was incredibly important to be able to do that. The second one is to maintain essential communications. That doesn't refer to things like radio and telephone communications. What that means here for all the logisticians who know what I'm talking about is that network of communications that allows for the deployment and sustainment of large forces overseas. So we're talking sea and air lines of communication, transportation nodes, logistics nodes, and so on. We've got to be able to expand that and maintain it. In other words, without that, we can't do this other stuff. Wearing down and undermining German resistance by air and other elements. This, of course, is the genesis of what? The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, correct? That was determined right away in 1941. We need to start bombing Germany's homeland now. The next one, which is also important, is, of course, the development of continuous offensive action. We can't let them have a breathing space. We've got to attack them wherever they are, whenever we can. And then finally, this major last one is the famous decision to go Germany first. We're going to focus on Germany, and we'll conduct a holding action against Japan. We'll take out Germany, and then we'll turn our attention to the Japanese. Now, the one that I skipped here is this one, closing and tightening the ring around Germany. And the way that they define that physically is right here. They actually had language. These words, and we've drawn a little line on a map here to sort of so you can visualize the words, but that's what they're talking about, is creating a ring around Germany and then closing it and tightening it. And you can see here that it was specifically stated that one of the ways to do this was to gain possession of the whole North African coast. Again, one of the major points of genesis for Operation Torch. Okay, now JP50 tells us that the very first thing that we need to do when we begin the process of design is understand termination criteria. Now, I want you to keep in mind that what I've got on the next several slides here is this little box down here that shows all those elements of operational design, and you'll see where we're checking them off as we put our design together. So what are termination criteria? Think back to those hazy days last summer when you read Dead Carl. And Dead Carl said that we have to have a political object of the war. That is what the termination criteria are. Now, I've taken a little license here and given you the war termination criteria. These termination criteria were not actually developed until 1943, after North Africa had been seized. But this war termination criteria is unconditional surrender of the Axis powers and the destruction of the philosophies in those countries. The destruction of Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, and militaristic imperialism in Japan. We're going to make them surrender unconditionally, and we're going to destroy those philosophies. That's the termination criteria for the war. Now we're going to talk about the campaign end state for the military. Again, joint doctrine defines the military end state as a point in time or circumstances beyond which the president does not require the military instrument to be the primary means of achieving national objectives. So you may achieve the military end state. There still may be work that needs to be done, but the military is no longer the primary element that's going to do that work. Okay? That's how we define the military end state. And it was very clear in the Arcadia Conference what the military end state for Torch would be, and that is complete control of North Africa from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Military end state. All right, now that we understand strategic guidance and direction, we have to understand the operational environment. Again, one of the reasons why we use history here is so that you can get used to going back and thinking about things that happened in the past as a way of understanding the current operating environment. That seems intuitive. It's worth restating. So we're going to step back a little bit further than Torch so that you can have some understanding of some of the stuff that's going on here. And it's useful here to go back and talk about things all the way back to June and July of 1940. As you might remember from some of your earlier courses, France surrendered to Germany and signed an armistice on June 20th, 1940. One of the terms of that armistice was that the French state has centered in Vichy in order to retain any level of sovereignty over their remaining national territory and their territories overseas, they would have to be collaborationist. And the minute that they stopped cooperating and collaborating with the Germans would seize all their remaining territory. Well, what that created was, for the British, who were the last remaining holdouts at this point against the Nazis, was some fear. The French fleet at that time was the fourth largest in the world. And it had been a matter of British policy for at least 100, if not 200 years, that they would not allow any power or combination of powers to have enough naval strength to threaten the approaches to their island. They would not allow that to happen. And they were afraid that with this armistice, the French Navy, combined with the German Navy and the Italian Navy, would be just that kind of combination. And they were absolutely determined that the French Navy would not fall into the hands of the Germans. Now, part of the French Navy was at Toulon in southern France, and the French naval commanders there, before the Germans could take possession of their ships, they scuttled all of them. Yes, great. But at least 50% of the French battle fleet still remained in bases in North Africa, primarily outside Oran in French Algeria. And the British thought, there's no way we're going to allow the Germans to have those ships. So the British Mediterranean fleet sailed to Oran and parked outside the port and sent a message to the French commander there and said, here's an ultimatum. Give us your ships now, or we're going to sink them. Your choice. They thought, hey, maybe these guys will do the same thing they did in Toulon. Maybe they'll scuttle them, or maybe they'll just come over and join us, because we've given them that option. The French commander at the time said, no, we're not doing that. We're not surrendering our ships to you or anyone else. Too bad for you. So the British launched Operation Catapult, and over 5 days sank the French fleet. It was an extraordinarily successful operation for the British, not so much for the French fleet. And in fact, you can see that the French casualties here. As far as I know, there's only 2 British wounded airmen. 84% of the French capital ships are neutralized, and we have 2 major results. Number one is a significant military result. The French fleet is no longer a factor, just isn't. So the British were extremely successful in reducing that problem. But what they did was they created a deep, deep well of hatred, especially among the French military and the government, to the British, especially the French Navy. And that will come into play here in just a bit. The other thing that's going on, as I said, is this seesaw desert warfare between Libya and Egypt, between initially the Italians and the British, and then after 1941, the German Africa Corps joining with the Italians. In 1940, in the fall, the Italians invaded Egypt, trying to drive the British out of Egypt and to seize Port Said and the Suez Canal. They were driven back by the British. At that point, they asked for help from the Germans. Rommel deployed with the Africa Corps and was able to drive back. And then in late 1941, the British attacked into 1942 and drove the Italians and the Germans back to this line in Libya. So it's important to understand that that was going on while the planning for Operation Torch was occurring. So now we've got a slide that's, I'm going to show you a lot of the different political and military considerations that were going on as we try to understand this operational environment. I want to point out, thanks Chris, this is a good point, this is the Mediterranean in 1933. This is also the Mediterranean in 1941. Okay, what this map depicts is which powers controlled these areas, okay? So the tan color here is French colonial territory, to include Syria and Lebanon. This brownish color is British territory. This is Italian territory, okay? So we've got this situation that we just discussed with the seesaw battle, and at the time of the beginning of torch planning, the British had pushed the Germans and the Italians back into Libya. The other thing that was happening here is that the British needed to sustain their operational forces in the desert using this line of communications through the Mediterranean. Now, previous to World War II, this had never been a problem because the British Royal Navy was ascendant to the Mediterranean. But what began to happen as the war went on was that the Italians and the Germans expanded their ability to interdict this line of supply by having air bases both in Italy and Sicily, but then also in the North African coast. And then in 1941, in the spring, they also seized the island of Crete and established air and naval forces there. You can see these are just notional rings, but they were really able to interdict this line of supply. So this created a significant operational problem for the British, making them, and then later the Americans, reliant on having to send vessels all the way around Africa to sustain forces not only in Egypt, but also in the Far East and India. The Germans and the Italians also had their own problems. They had an Axis resupply route that went down through Italy, through Sicily and then across the Mediterranean to their primary port in Tripoli. That was the biggest port in Italian North Africa that had the biggest throughput capability. That was their major port. From there, they would have to move stuff overland to their big base at El Agila, and then overland, depending on where this seesaw battle was going on. You can see that that creates some vulnerabilities for them as well. This line of supply here is able to be interdicted by air and sea, and this line of supply is able to be interdicted by air, provided that the British have the operational reach to get there. They were able to use ports along the coast like Tobruk and Benghazi, but given the nature of this seesaw fighting, those weren't entirely reliable. And again, as we say that they were able to be interdicted, one of the things that's key is that the British maintained their base at Malta throughout the war in the face of continuous Axis attacks, and they had sea and air forces there that were also constantly trying to interdict this Axis line of supply. So what to do? This is, of course, the British desire as expressed by Hitler, or sorry, not Hitler, expressed by Churchill in the Arcadia Conference. He wanted somebody to be able to attack into the rear of the Axis positions here and potentially threaten or seize Tripoli, and thereby indirectly eliminating the problem in North Africa. The Vichy French were not going to do that. First of all, they knew that if they sided with the Allies, they were going to lose all their sovereignty. The Germans were going to take over the rest of metropolitan France and probably try to take over their colonies. But the other thing was that after this Mers el-Kabir thing, the Vichy French had no interest in doing anything other than sticking it to the British, because they had just sunk their fleet. So that wasn't going to happen. So what Churchill suggested was, hey, everybody likes the Americans, right? Let's have the Americans do it. If the Americans land some forces in North Africa, they can take some ports. The Vichy French will probably allow them to do this. They can move through Algeria and Tunisia and then threaten the Germans. Well, at the time, in 1941 and 1942, the United States had not yet begun to mobilize its forces, and so it didn't have adequate trained units or enough stuff to really pull this off independently. And so there was going to have to be a small British component to this invasion, primarily from the Royal Navy, in order to be able to pull this off. And so that combined, the Allies realized, hey, we can scrape together 3 task forces and we can seize 3 major ports on the North African coast, getting us close so that we have a quick overland shot to get to Tunis, which is the major port, of course, in Tunisia. And that puts us that much closer to being able to threaten German lines of communication. But in order to do that, the Americans said, well, wait a second. We got to protect our own line of communications. What about over here? If we have to rely on getting things through the Straits of Gibraltar, that's a problem. So the Americans said, well, if we do this, we're going to have to launch a force back to take Casablanca. Well, things are starting to get complicated. And so what the Allies did is what... The other thing is that I can't skip this. The enemy always gets a vote, right? So the analysis of this whole campaign, they had to go back and think, okay, what is the enemy going to do? And you, as planners, all understand that what you do is when you think about enemy activities, potential enemy activities, you think about the most likely course of action and the most dangerous course of action, the most likely and the most dangerous. Well, the most likely course of action for the Axis was to use that same line and reinforce Tunis and begin building up Axis forces in Tunisia to prevent this exact thing from happening. The most dangerous course of action would be to move Axis forces through collaborationist France down through fascist Spain, which was neutral but friendly towards the Axis, into Spanish Morocco, and then be able to threaten the Allies from the rear. Most dangerous course of action. Well, in order to deal with this, the Allies came up with 3 primary strategic assumptions. One would be that Spain would resist a German incursion, and it would take at least 3 months for the Germans to get through Spain. The second one is that once Spain was invaded, they would allow Allied forces into Spanish Morocco to prevent an assault crossing on the Straits of Gibraltar. And then the third one would be that French forces in North Africa might resist initially, but then they would allow this to happen. Well, what you do in planning is you take your assumptions and you try to turn them into facts. And if you can't turn them into facts, then you have to either discard those assumptions or change the plan. What the Allies thought was, okay, in order to prevent our lines of communication from being threatened, the Americans said, no, we got to land at Casablanca. Well, since we only have the ability to do 3 task forces, that removes the ability to go as far as we want in Algeria. So we're going to do 3 landings, but one of them is going to be in Morocco and 2 of them are going to be in Algeria. By doing that, it changes this calculus of being able to get to Tunis quickly. But it also removes the requirement to go backwards. It puts us in a position to directly defend against a German incursion across Gibraltar, but it also obviates this plan. We have to go back and redo the plan. These assumptions can't be turned into facts. We're going to change things around. What they decided to do was go with these 3 landings, come up with a different plan to attack across the rest of North Africa to take Tunis. And in doing so, they came up with one primary operational assumption, which is we need to take Tunis within 26 days of the invasion, otherwise the Axis will get there and beat us to the punch. 26 days. Pretty significant requirement that they had there. In the meantime, while this was going on, Rommel had counterattacked and had pushed the British all the way back to El Alamein and threatening Alexandria, Cairo, and the Suez Canal itself. All right, here's our current state. We've already talked about this a little bit, so we've gone into this. That's part of the current state. We're going to skip over now, and I'll show you this map. So this shows the high water mark of the Axis in 1942. German forces have driven down into the Caucasus. It's off this map. They were only eventually stopped at Stalingrad, but this is really the high water mark of the Axis during World War II. Everything in red is either conquered by or allied with the Nazis and the fascists. You can see this Anglophobia going between Vichy France and Britain. You can see these interdicted supply convoys trying to get to Egypt, and this notion that in order to do Lend-Lease and resupply, the Allies are going to have to go all the way around Africa. We've got neutral but pro-Axis Spain and the state collaborators of Vichy government in France and North Africa. The Joint Pub tells us that when we think about analyzing the current operational condition, we have to describe actors, tensions, and relationships. So we're going to do that here. Primary actor, in this case, Marshal Pétain on the left, who is the leader of Vichy France, shaking hands with Hitler in the fall of 1940. And again, his policy was, the official state policy of Vichy France is collaboration with the Nazis. Our next major actor here is Admiral Darlan, who is the French colonial administrator in North Africa. He's in charge politically of all French North African possessions. His previous job was, guess what? He was the commander of the French fleet. Do you think he liked the British? No. He viscerally hated the British. Our next major actor is Generalissimo Francisco Franco, the fascist leader of neutral and yet friendly Spain, friendly with the Axis. One of the big questions throughout this period was which way would the Spanish go? And one of the assumptions that the Allies had, at least for the current condition or the current state, was the tendency that the Spanish ultimately were probably going to side with the Nazis and join the war effort against the Allies. Okay, here's what our desired state is. This is where we want to go. So we just talked about the current condition. Now we're talking about what we want the condition to be. All the blue is controlled by the Allies. So we want the Allies to control the entire North African coast. When we talk about the operating environment, we also have to understand tendencies and potentials. And so I've got a few listed here. Obviously, the Axis forces are going to have the tendency to continue efforts to control North Africa and push towards the Suez Canal. The Vichy French will remain collaborationist or neutral for real. And we see that Spain will probably remain pro-Axis. For potentials, there's one plus. We have the potential here that we can convert the French to join the Allies and fight against the Axis. one negative is that potentially the Spanish will formally declare to go with the Axis. Okay. JP50 says that when we understand the operational environment, one of the things we have to do is determine centers of gravity. And what the Allies decided, well, first of all, there's a definition up there of what a center of gravity is. Some of you may remember that terminology from your war theory course. I get some nods on that. It comes from Clausewitz. None of this stuff is new. So the center of gravity is a source of power that provides moral, physical strength, freedom of action, or will to act. What the Allied planners determined, their centers of gravity are up here. You have to have an enemy center of gravity, but you also have your own centers of gravity. And when you develop a plan, not only do you need to be attacking the enemy centers of gravity, you need to be defending your own. These are primarily American constructs. The British may have had a slightly different take on this, but this is what the Americans came up with. For centers of gravity, you also have them at every level of war. And what are the 3 levels of war? Anybody? Strategic, operational, and tactical. We're not going to talk about tactical here. We've got a strategic cog. The Americans saw that as the alliance. We're not going to allow this alliance to fail. We can't let the British be knocked out. We can't let the Russians be knocked out. Our center of gravity, strategically, is this alliance. That should sound familiar to many of you because the United States still views as one of our major strategic centers of gravity our alliance systems. Okay, as an operational center of gravity, the United States felt that it was the ability to project force overseas and sustain it once it was there. Does that sound familiar? Yes. If we can't do that, we can't really do anything. So that's our operational center of gravity. We do an analysis of centers of gravity, and you guys will go through this in your course. We look at critical capabilities, critical requirements, and critical vulnerabilities. And in this case, the critical capabilities to sustain forces overseas. Requirement is all of these things. And the vulnerability, as viewed here in North Africa, is this not well-developed road and rail network in North Africa that the planners really rated as being only sufficient to sustain the native population of North Africa. It wasn't big enough or well-developed enough to sustain large forces, so that was a pretty significant vulnerability. On the Axis side, the strategic cog is the German military, hence the desire to go right after the German military at their home, kick their butts, and win the war all at once. If we're not going to do that, operationally, we need to look at North Africa. That assessment was German armored forces, which provided them an operational maneuver capability. If we can attack their armored forces and defeat them, the rest of the stuff in North Africa is going to die on the vine. Their critical requirements are therefore then fuel, resupply, and the Luftwaffe to do defensive counter-air. If we can remove the Luftwaffe capability, we can significantly degrade their armored forces. And again, this vulnerability is sea and air lines of communication. Notice down in the box here, we're now on centers of gravity. Okay, step 3 of the process of design is defining the problem. Now, this is an abbreviation. Normally, when you define a problem, you actually write this out longhand. We've got some bullets here for the purposes of the briefing. Bottom line up front, Axis forces need to be eliminated in order to gain control. That's what's preventing us from getting from our current state to our desired state. There's 4 elements that we have in doctrine that need to be included in any definition of a problem. The first one is tensions between the current and the desired state. Obviously, there's a tension here between Axis force goals and Allied force goals. That's really easy to say here, but most of the problems that you folks are going to be presented with and have been in your careers are a heck of a lot more complex than this. And so this is a difficult thing to get through sometimes to figure out exactly what those tensions are. In this case, it's fairly straightforward. In addition, we've got a lot of tensions within the French themselves. There's a desire to maintain French sovereignty. There's also a desire, perhaps, to support the Allies against the Germans. And then there's also this Vichy antipathy towards the British. Significant tensions within the French. The next thing that we talk about are elements which must change or must remain the same in order for us to solve this problem. We've got to change the Vichy forces. They either need to be changed or they need to be replaced. We have to defeat or destroy the Axis armored forces. We have to restore freedom of navigation in the Mediterranean, and we've got to keep Spain neutral. We can't allow Spain to go towards the Germans. Then we talk about opportunities and threats. this opportunity here is to seize the ports that are supporting the Axis forces. This operation will provide us that opportunity. One of the threats is, as we've discussed, that Spain will support the Axis and threaten our line of communication. And then lastly, we talk about limitations. One of them has to deal with stuff, and the other one has to do with politics. We don't have enough stuff right now to do very much. There's extraordinary demands on the United States, even based on the limited production that we had in 1941 and 42. And that the other thing is the U.S. has to lead operations against the French because they hate the British so much that it will cause a serious shooting fight if the British are the ones that take the lead. All right. Step 4, develop an operational approach. Now, this is where we bring art into this. Now, I can assure you that this is going to be confusing for some of you, but by the end of this course, you will all be able to do this in your sleep. Seriously. So what we've got here is our current state, our desired state, our political object of the war, the political end state, and we've got our military end state. Campaign end state, complete control of North Africa. That's what we want. And the way that we're going to get there is we're going to first have a few lines of effort and lines of operation. Does that sound familiar? Yes. Jomini, Clausewitz. A line of effort is defined in our joint doctrine as something that is held together with the logic of purpose. Okay? Cause and effect. What we're going to try to do here is create a series of effects that will get us where we want to go. It's designed to enable our friendly cog, which is what? To sustain ourselves overseas. And we're going to try to influence the French in North Africa. When I put influence up here, what that is, it's not an element of design, but what it is are, they're called defeat and stability mechanisms. It's kind of like a freebie when you're doing operational art. You can apply these things as a better way of describing what it is that you're trying to achieve. So this line of effort is focused on influencing the Vichy French. Okay, so our next line of effort is preventing an attack from Spanish Morocco. It's again designed to protect our friendly cog, and we've got a bunch of objectives linked that are going to help us get there, designed to control our vulnerable lines of communication. Our first line of operation is to attack Axis forces west to east. West to east. A line of operation defines the exterior or interior orientation of the force. It's also focused either on geography or the enemy. Okay? And what we've got here are a series of decisive points that are going to get us to attack the enemy cog. And one of the things that we can do here is to attack the enemy directly or indirectly. Who here remembers the indirect approach? Right? Yes, okay? So we're going to be attacking the enemy indirectly. All right. And we already talked about this, the direct or indirect approach. Our final line of operation is to attack east to west, from the British forces in Egypt west against the Afrika Korps, the German Panzer Army here. And the defeat mechanism is to defeat or destroy. We're attacking the enemy cog directly across a series of decisive points, getting us to the Axis forces being destroyed. Now, what we've got here is forces operating on exterior lines. And again, this comes directly from Jomini. Exterior lines means that our forces are converging on the enemy, right? And what we've done is we've put the Axis forces into a position where they're fighting on interior lines. Okay. Our last line of effort is to interdict Axis supply across the Mediterranean. We're isolating, and we're attacking their cog indirectly. Now let's go through each one of these in turn. So our first line of effort is to work the French in North Africa. And we're going to do that by trying to achieve a number of linked effects. And the definition of effect is right there. Now what the Allies figured was that there was a range at which the French could operate, going from resistance to cooperation. We were okay with acquiescence, but what we really wanted was cooperation. And the way that we were going to do that is to do some things in North Africa. We had a really restrictive ROE, do not fire against unless fired upon, information operations such as leaflet drops and radio broadcasts. We made sure there was a U.S. lead and that all the lead units in the United States Army that were landing had big American flags that they were carrying and also had big American armbands. Does that sound familiar? Who here's in the Army? Hold up your sleeve. Is there a reason why the American flag's there? Yeah, it's the same reason here. And then we've got some diplomatic efforts, both overt and covert, that went on before the operation and afterwards. Next effect, we want to make sure that the French retain governance of these territories. U.S. planners and British planners did not want to have to inherit the governance of huge portions of North Africa. The expectation was that we would let the French continue to govern these. That way we didn't have to, and we could focus our forces on the enemy. And the way that we were going to do that is either try to enlist the current French government, and if that failed, get rid of them and replace them with Free French. And then the final effect we want to do is maintain unimpeded control of that really austere rail and road network. We had to do that in order to succeed. Okay, next line of effort. We've got a number of objectives linked through the logic of purpose, protecting our lines of communications. The way we're going to do that is seize ports in the Atlantic coast, as we've already discussed, and work the Spanish that way. Okay, our first line of operation, we're dislocating Axis forces attacking west to east, and we're connecting a number of decisive points geographically in order to do that. These are those ports along the coast, ending up with seizing Tripoli, the Axis base, attacking the enemy's center of gravity indirectly. You can see that right here. All of these ports in order to get down to Tripoli. Now, here's a concept that we need to add in here, operational reach. Operational reach is the distance and duration that your forces, as currently constituted, can go. And in this case, the farthest that they could get in these initial assaults was to Algiers. A lot of this was dependent on airfields, and we had land-based aircraft that were supporting these invasions. If you can seize more airfields, you can extend your operational reach. And this is called arranging operations. We're down here. And in this case, we're conducting sequential operations. We're going to do some seizures. We're going to move along and sequentially take ports and airfields along the coast to extend our operational reach so that we can achieve our objectives. Okay. Next line of effort, attacking from east to west. Defeat the German Panzer Army, German and Italian Panzer Army, move through Tobruk, Benghazi, and then seize Tripoli on the ground, attacking the enemy center of gravity directly. Where we're doing this in arranging operations is we're going to do this simultaneously with the assault landings in French North Africa in order to provide or present the enemy with multiple simultaneous dilemmas throughout the depth and breadth of the battle space. If the enemy has multiple things to try to deal with, he's going to be less likely to be able to handle them. Now, one other thing that we've got down here in our elements of operational design is this notion of forces and functions. Operations can be directed against a function, like one of the 6 joint functions, like logistics, or they can be directed against a force. And in this case, this line of effort, line of operation is directed against Axis forces directly. Our final line of effort is to is to threaten the Axis lines of communication by attacking their sea and airports and their sea resupply and so on, indirectly attacking their COG, and this is an emphasis on Axis functions, on their logistics and sustainment. Okay, let's talk about what actually happened. Here is the actual mission statement as issued by then Lieutenant General Eisenhower on the eve of the invasion. Who, what, when, where, and why. You notice that we're really concerned about the earliest possible occupation of Tunisia. That's the purpose, right? Here's the critical task, here's the purpose. And then we've also got this subsequent concern here, worried about an incursion into Spanish Morocco. How are we going to do this? 3 simultaneous joint task force entry operations spread across the North African coast. And again, if you think about this, for those of you that are so inclined, this is like an A2AD challenge. These places are defended. We've got to get in there. And the Germans and the Italians, and in some cases the French, are going to try to prevent us from gaining entry. It's an A2AD challenge. And it's largely about extending operational reach. The land-based aircraft that we have at Gibraltar can only reach out about 400 miles. And so in order to be able to extend that operational reach, we've got to seize ports and airfields. And the major airfield, which is now actually the Algiers International Airport, here is going to extend our operational reach all the way out to Tunis, which is where we need to go, and then further. Okay? So this Western Task Force that you've read about, led by who? George Patton. 3 landings on the coast of Morocco, some pretty heavy fighting. The first 2, and maybe the only 2, Air Force Medals of Honor awarded for ground action in World War II were both awarded here. One other thing to note, the only currently operational U.S. aircraft carrier was involved there, USS Ranger. All the others were either sunk or were being repaired. So the only operational fleet aircraft carrier that the United States had available at this time was there. You can imagine being Admiral Hewitt being really concerned about the safety of that carrier, because if he lost it, no aircraft carriers for the United States Navy. The Center Task Force at the port of Oran, again, the same place where the French fleet had been based. It's a combined British Naval Task Force and American ground force. These guys are the only ones that actually seized their objectives through combat. All the other 2 landings, there was eventually a truce and fighting ceased. 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Ranger Battalion and a brigade from the 1st Armored Division actually the only ones that had to fight all the way through and directly seize their objectives and secure them. Now, one of the things that happened that you've read about is that there was a direct harbor assault here, Operation Reservist. Now, we've talked about the operational level of war. I think it's useful here to dive down into the tactical level just to show you a World War II era A2AD challenge, because some of these things have never changed. What we've got here is the objective. There's the port. This is a contemporary photograph. And we've got shore batteries and coastal artillery protecting it. What this doesn't show is that there's another mole down here that also had more French warships and another shore battery. The plan was to take these 2 Lend-Lease destroyers that the British had, they'd gotten from the United States. Actually, they started out as Coast Guard cutters, which is kind of interesting. Load them up with the U.S. Infantry Battalion, have them drive directly into the port, unload U.S. soldiers into the port to seize and secure the facilities, because we needed these ports, and if the French sabotaged them, we'd be in trouble. So, as it worked out, there was the direct harbor assault. The only thing that really succeeded was that there was a really good smoke screen for a while. Everything else was an abysmal failure, as you may remember reading about. Both ships were sunk. The casualties were pretty intense. 88% casualties for that infantry battalion. A total failure. Now, 88% casualty rate, what does that mean? You familiar with the charge of the Light Brigade? Roughly 40% casualties. And if you're not familiar with that, Pickett's charge, roughly 50% casualty rate. These guys had an 88% casualty rate. A2AD challenge. So when you're thinking about that, be thinking about whether or not it's a good idea to directly assault in an A2AD challenge, or indirectly assault. Here in the Eastern Task Force, we've got another combined force. This was the one that was really combined, in some cases down to the battalion level, British and American soldiers working together, because there just weren't enough trained and equipped Americans. All British naval forces, again, landing in multiple beaches, and also another direct harbor assault, which was slightly more successful. One company, U.S. infantry company, got on the ground, but they eventually ran out of ammunition and had to surrender. The others were able to withdraw, so the casualties weren't nearly as high. And again, here, almost immediately there was a truce, and so the objectives were seized in some cases without very much fighting at all. And then we got 26 days to take Tunis. So the way that that was done was almost immediately there were a series of amphibious and airborne landings moving up the coast to seize the port of Bone. I think that's the right way to pronounce that. And that was, as you might remember, that was one of the initial objectives when they first started planning this. That was seized within a few days on 12th of November, just a couple of days after the landings in Algeria, and then with the view to moving rapidly to seize Tunis. Now, what actually happened? When the Germans, as expected, began to land forces in Tunis, they had this exact same calculus with what the French might do. And in this case, the French went to full cooperation. Not only did they allow the Germans to land unimpeded, but they continued to man anti-aircraft defenses and so on in the ports so that the Germans were freed up to have all of their forces go against the Allies. And what ended up happening was a series of engagements starting on the 17th of November that led to stalemate. I think let's go back and see the timing of this east and west simultaneous operations, those two lines of operation converging on exterior lines against the enemy, nearly simultaneous and quite successful up until a certain point. Now again, multiple attacks from the Allied side to try to break through the German lines in Tunisia. They were unsuccessful. And finally, on Christmas Eve, 1942, a little over a month after the landings, General Eisenhower decided, okay, we're going to take an operational pause. We're going to draw back a little bit. We're going to reset, and we'll do some more deliberate operations to actually make this happen. The opportunistic phase was over. What the Joint Doctrine tells us to do is that if any of these conditions are met in our continuous and recursive refinement of our plan, which is, again, iterative, if any of these happen, we have to reframe the problem. And in this case, 3 of them happened. There was a variance between the actual state and what we thought was going to happen. The desired conditions were not achievable given the current operational approach, and a key assumption was invalidated. In this case, the French cooperated actively with the Germans in Tunisia. And so what did they do? They pulled back, they reframed the problem, they worked the plan again, and they were able to succeed. So, lessons for today. Joint forcible entry operations. If you have to plan something like this, you should be considering these things. Air cover. A2AD. The Torch landings were dispersed primarily because they did not want to go directly into the enemy defenses to overcome this A2AD challenge. They tried an indirect approach to get after these ports. The only places where they did a direct approach against the A2AD challenge, both times, an abysmal failure. Just keep that in mind. So if later in this course you're faced with an A2AD challenge, you might want to take these things into consideration. If the Allies had actually gone at a direct approach in this A2AD threat, what they would have done is gone right through the Mediterranean just to directly attack Tripoli, right? Well, the reason they didn't do that is because of this A2AD challenge. So they used an indirect approach, and they were successful. The Germans actually delayed their response to these invasions because they thought the Allies were going to do this, and they didn't. And then lastly, talking about some elements of operational design, the Allies didn't have this formal doctrine at the time, but they did all this stuff. So this stuff is timeless. Doctrine is, in some senses, the embodiment of history. We don't pull doctrine out of a hat like a rabbit. It comes from experience. It comes from historical practice. And so when you're reading doctrine, remember that it's the distilled lessons of the past that give us the ability to perform operations here in the future. That's why it's important. General Mattis once said when he was the commander at CENTCOM, the reason that we want military officers to read history is because so you can learn from somebody else's mistakes and not make them yourself. And that's why we have you understand doctrine. Here's the results. Pretty significant. Over 500,000 Axis casualties or prisoners. By comparison, almost double that which the Axis lost at Stalingrad. It's probably one of the most significant victories of the war in that regard. One of the negatives, potentially, is that it committed the Allies to a Mediterranean strategy, which the Americans did not necessarily agree with. But it did create a strain in German-Italian relations, and shortly after the seizure of North Africa and then the subsequent invasion of Sicily, the Italians actually surrendered, signed an armistice with the United States and Britain, and the Germans were then required to defend Italy with no Italian cooperation. And so ultimately, we achieved both the military end state and ultimately, as part of a sequential series of campaigns, achieved the strategic end state. Now, here's your cake. You guys are going to have access to these slides, so you can refer back to this cake anytime you want as you're figuring out the recipe. All right? That's why we did this. I don't expect you guys to know all this right now. I don't expect you to be able to articulate it. But by the end of this course, you'll be able to build this cake all on your own. And in fact, really what you'll be doing is building this cake, right? Okay. We've got just a few minutes left. Any questions? Thank you very much.